So, as you may or may not know, I have been working with the Unitarian Universalist Ministry for Earth since last February. Took on a more intense role in July to plot a way forward for Ministry for Earth at a time when all UUs and, frankly, everyone everywhere should be not just thinking about the fragile state of our planet, but also doing something every day to address that fragility. As such, today I thought I'd talk about our role and the courage it will take to ensure that all life on this precious planet can flourish. Now, maybe because it's a a person being born in the 60s, but whenever I start talking about environmental issues, I am reminded of that wonderful moment in the Dr. Seuss book, The Lorax, when our little orange friend pops out of a tree and turns to the onceler and says, "I speak for the trees have no tongues." And then he has to speak for the barbaloots and the swami swans and the fish, because he took it upon himself to give voice to the voiceless. And now, if we are really paying attention, we can realize that the trees and the seas and the bees have all been speaking to us for quite some time. I just wonder if we haven't been listening. Many of us are probably old enough many of us in this room and online are probably old enough to remember that in 1976, President Jimmy Carter installed solar panels on the roof of the White House. This little tidbit of information alone should remind us that people, including people in power, have known for a long time that we needed to rethink our dependence on fossil fuels and utilize what is often called alternative energy sources, but really renewable energy sources. You also probably know then that when Ronald Reagan became president, his first act was to remove those solar panels from the White House. What is also interesting is that in the late 70s, actually 1979 to be exact, the American Petroleum Institute founded the CO2 and Climate Task Force, which brought together the major oil companies to work together with their respective scientists, whom many companies had actually hired to consider the fact that, quote, man has a time window of 5 to 10 years before the need for hard decisions regarding changes in energy strategies might become critical. This institute was charged with addressing carbon use and emissions, and as their findings grew more and more dire, they became more and more secretive and ultimately disbanded and moved their focus to hiring lobbyists to counteract legislation that regulated carbon emissions. And alas, we've been paying for those decisions ever since. The really sad part, though, is that some people pay a higher price for that dependence on fossil fuels than others. And it's usually not the folks who are releasing the most carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Our siblings in the global south and what the West calls underdeveloped nations, but we use that as code for nations that have been colonized or marginalized or actively exploited by the United States, England, others. They are the ones who feel it the most. Climate change does not impact each of us equally. The United States and China are the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases, thus the most to blame for our current climate chaos. And yet, it is our human family across the globe who already suffer challenges and indignities due to structural violence, systemic racism, and their horrific legacy of colonialism. And they are the ones who feel the effects most. Our self-centered, myopic way of living has caused unspeakable harm to humans. It has also caused unspeakable harm to mammals, reptiles, amphibians, insects, trees, etc. I almost hate to state some of these statistics out loud, but in the last 50 years, we have lost 70% of wildlife on this planet. A cursory glance at the news, and we read about the death of 1 billion snow crabs in the Pacific Northwest, and the loss of salmon runs, and the decrease in pollinators. But I'm not here today to list all the harm and suffering because I'm quite sure all of us in this room and on Zoom already know about it. What I do want to focus on is what can be done about it. Each spring semester, so now, and I'm so excited, I get to teach a course at Vassar College entitled Science, Spirituality, and Peace Education, Addressing Climate Change. And one of the things we do in that class is to talk about the notion of personal responsibility. We pick the question of, do our individual acts matter? I was actually inspired to add that question to the syllabus last year because of a podcast I listened to a few years ago that debated the individual versus systemic responsibility question. Spoiler alert, both matter, but maybe not for the reasons you might think. The reality is that we need to transform our entire way of life, way of thinking, way of being and doing, which means systemic change. But one part of getting there along the way is also through individual shifts in how we live and what we model for our friends, neighbors, and family. So over at UU Ministry for Earth, we launched an initiative called Monthly Musings to provide ministers and congregations with eco-minded readings and resources every month. And if you're not receiving it, I'll make sure that you get on the list here. And when I was researching for the month of October, I found this quote from St. Francis of Assisi. Remember that when you leave this earth, you can take with you nothing that you have received, only what you have given, a full heart, enriched by honest service, love, sacrifice, and courage. It invited me to reflect on how we, UUs, show up in the world. For the most part, we do good, right? I like to think so. We're at the protests. We fight for people's rights. We create welcoming congregations. But I also know that sometimes we can hide behind that do-gooder liberalness of our faith tradition. We can fall into a kind of comfortable nonchalance, thinking perhaps that we do enough. But the stakes are much, much too high. We have less than 6 years to fix things. 6 years. All those corporations who spend millions of dollars on their greenwashing ads say, we're going to do X, Y, and Z by 2050. Too late. Or they try to convince us that each of us and our individual choices, like taking shorter showers or changing the light bulbs, is what's going to make the difference. I think that might be smoke and mirrors. Yes, of course, take shorter showers. Yes, use LED bulbs. And yes, stop buying plastic. All those things. Yes, eat less meat. Support local agriculture and local farms. Yes, yes, yes. And demand that these companies stop creating plastics in the first place. Demand that these companies stop investing in fossil fuels. Demand that your community make local food accessible and affordable. Demand that your town increases public transportation and then use it. And demand that politicians think 7 generations into the future instead of focusing only on now, themselves, and the folks who are probably greasing their palms. As biologist Hope Jahren, in her book, The Story of More, says, all species will go extinct eventually, even our own. It is one of nature's few imperatives. As of today, however, that train has not quite left the station. We still have some control over our demise, namely, how long it will take and how much our children and grandchildren will suffer. If we want to take action, we should get started while it still matters what we do. So, what can we do? Obviously, start with the stuff I mentioned earlier. But then I'm going to invite us to be more courageous. Our book today, What Do You Do with a Chance, provides us with some inspiration. We have the chance now to do something courageous that can change the course of humanity, and I would expand that to all life, and in doing so, may just allow all living things and non living things to thrive on Earth, at least for a bit longer. But we need the courage to usher in a new way of living and a new way of being. Courage is key because it's not going to be the small personal things that we do that matter most. We need the courage to think beyond ourselves, to raise awareness, to subvert the system, to say, hey, capitalism and this American acquisition dream way of life is actually killing us all. Now, I am also one of the core organizers of the Rivers and Mountains Green Faith Circle that operates in Ulster, Greene, Columbia, Dutchess, and Berkshire counties. We've been doing awareness raising interfaith actions for the past year. We did one recently in Albany. Maybe some of you were there. One of our offerings, done by my friend Michael Richardson, is a workshop on how to divest money from fossil fuels. Things as quotidian as where you bank, where you get your home or car insurance, what credit cards you use, and how you invest your money can actually make a huge difference. Here's what you need to know. Chase Bank has invested a total of $382 billion in fossil fuels in the last 5 years. Citibank, $285 billion. Wells Fargo, $272 billion. Bank of America, $232 billion. And TD Bank, $141 billion. If you bank with any of these institutions, it's time for you to break up with them. And it's time to demand that they do better. I'll tell you a little story. At the start of this academic year, I learned that my employer, Vassar College, had invited Chase Bank to be our bank on campus. This information, added to the fact that I am forced to handle my retirement plan through Fidelity, which holds $167 billion in fossil fuel stocks, made smoke almost literally come out of my ears, like a cartoon character. I read the email and thought, do I just let this go? Can I just let this go? The answer was no. I was going to take my chance. I wrote to the comptroller of the college and asked for a meeting. I showed up with pages of information about the dirty dozen, but it's way more than a dozen, and how using Chase and Fidelity and even TIAA, which has taken a turn to the dark side for us educators, a little upsetting, is counter to the values we espouse at Vassar. And it goes without saying that it's counter to my values as a Unitarian Universalist. They listened. They seemed to understand. And Chase will still be the bank on campus. I then sent all my materials to a colleague who sits on the retirement committee. And we talked about it. He listened. He definitely understood, and he said he'd share it with the committee, but he had no idea what would happen. Now, on the surface, it would seem that my effort was a failure. Nothing will change. Nothing has changed this year. But the college is now clearly aware that someone is watching. Someone is bothered by our backdoor connection to the killing of life on the planet. And my being a pest, or maybe I should say a positive pain in the bottom, or maybe even more positively, a truth teller, might make people reconsider. But all I know is that had I said nothing, then nothing will ever change. So here's the thing: people who are in power, who are serving their God of greed, will never change unless we have the courage to force them to. And some of that courage is also us realizing that business as usual, especially if it has served us well, is actually harmful. And thus, we might need to give up some of our own comforts and privileges so we can do better by those who don't have those same comforts and privileges. So, divestment is one way to do this. And I would like to offer the chance for UU Schenectady to be part of one of our online workshops. We could talk about it later. And I also want to let you know that my colleague, who is the coordinator of the UU Young Adults for Climate Justice at Ministry for Earth, has joined us here today, Zoe Johnston. And Zoe and the amazing group of young adults, UU Young Adults, have put together a business resolution about divestment. And Zoe would love if you wanted to chat with her and see if you wanted to sign on in support. So after services, I invite everyone to have a conversation with this pretty rad and wonderful colleague of mine that I feel blessed to know and that was able to join us today. So divestment is one idea. We can also be sure that candidates we vote for have planet Earth on their actual agenda. And this goes for our denomination and our congregations. We should be asking, where is our congregational money invested? What does the UUA invest in? Will our next UUA president be clear on the course of humanity, and in doing so, may just allow, the need to address climate and environmental justice issues be part of their agenda? We are all the UUA, and we all have voices. I guess what I'm talking about is having the courage to disrupt the status quo. We have a long history of doing that as UUs. And then once we do a little bit of that disrupting, have the courage to live differently, which may mean living with less, living more simply, living more mindfully, and making decisions with all earthly life in mind. And you know what else? While we live during these challenging times, our democracy in peril, our planet suffering, our siblings of color still being tortured and killed, I believe it is an act of courage to be hopeful. In her latest book, Active Hope, Joanna Macy and her co-author, Chris Johnstone, invites us to live into a space of active hope. I know that for many of us, myself included, certainly my students, the enormity of the task at hand can make us feel overwhelmed, ineffective, small, maybe useless, and maybe even just so despairing that we hope someone else will take care of it. But we are it. We're what we've got. We're the ones we've been waiting for. Macy puts many ideas into how to foster active hope and work in the community in the book, but I'm going to summarize one because I kind of love it. She encourages folks to work with a partner to talk through 7 sentences. The sentences move us from gratitude to honoring the pain of the world into seeing things with new eyes and then determining the part you're going to play. We're each going to play going forth. So I invite us all to take time to recognize and name what we're grateful for, the many blessings we've had over the years. Then honor what is making our heart heavy. Then imagine what we'd like to see happen. What kind of world do we want for the next 7 generations? And then decide what each of us collectively, what we will do to bring that vision to life. We might feel more hopeful, and we might, one courageous, defiant, disrupting step at a time, may actually change this course we're on. I pray that we do. May it be so.